Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us today for this discussion. Just stop screen sharing and so we can see each other. Yes. Thank you for joining us today here for Diplomats, for running out of Diplomats discussion. And today we have a panel with Professor Marcus Contrast, Dr. Mary Drosopoula, Yorgos Kostakos, Fortini, Fortini Zaroyani, and Elizabeth Clements. So I would like to just first briefly introduce the panel and then we can straight get into the discussion. So Professor Marcus Contrast teaches international relations at the Vienna School of International Studies, having authored and edited a dozen books, as well as publishing in leading journals of this discipline. He specializes in international security, diplomacy, and international orders. His current research projects deal with the process of global and regional ordering and peaceful change and tech diplomacy. Thank you, Professor, for joining us. Next, we have Dr. Mary Drosopoula. She is an intercultural trainer and researcher experienced in international development, youth policy, democratization, and peace building. For over a decade, she has been working as a consultant with international organizations like UN Women, OSCE, RCC, etc., in conflict affected settings, amongst which Kosovo, Cyprus, Syria, and Turkey. She has been a human rights trainer with the Council of Europe since 2012, involved in flagship activities such as Euro-Arab cooperation with the League of Arab States and capacity building courses for government officials. Thank you, Mary, for joining us. Next, we have Yorgos Kostakos, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Brussels-based Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability. About half of his 30-year work experience has been with the UN, including with the Executive Office of the UN Secretary-General, the High-Level Panel on Global Sustainability, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and field missions for political affairs and human rights. The other half of his career has been with think tanks, academic institutions, and as a consultant on global governance for sustainability, peace, and resilience. Finally, we have the two authors of this paper called. So we have Fortini Zarayani. She's a young researcher and professional specializing in international security, mostly conflict and warfare studies and foreign policy, with a regional focus on the Middle East and North Africa. She is currently a PhD candidate researching on proxy warfare and threats of force, and she is also a research officer at the Anna Lindh Foundation. She holds a Master's of Advanced International Studies and a BA in Law, while she has extensive work experience in the international affairs policy field. And we have Elizabeth Clements, the co-author. She is the founder of the Policy Briefer, a youth research network organization focused on climate justice and human rights. She has obtained a master's degree in public policy and a postgraduate certificate in international studies, and has extensive experience in international affairs and policy analysis. Unfortunately, Elizabeth is not feeling quite the best today. So she is here, she's joined us, but she'll be limited in when she can address us, but she'll be here on chat and she'll be able to answer all the questions that we have. Finally, I am your moderator today. I'm Manan Shah. I'm a research, IT, and communications advisor at Foundation for Global Governance and Studies, and I'm based in India. Thank you. I think for the beginning, we'll get started with Yorgos introducing FOGs.
Thank you very much, Manan. Yes, I hope you can hear me. Thanks to all from my side too for being here, and of course, especially to our two authors of the paper who put a lot of effort into producing this and really going in depth into the causes of this diplomatic shortage, an issue that we had identified before as being there, but we had not really pinned down the way they've done. And I'm really grateful to them and for also their entrusting their work with us. And it has been issued as a paper of FOGs, which you can find, as well as an article on katoikos.world, which is a summary of their main findings. So I'm very glad to be here, and this is part of our work at FOGs. What we try to do is around changing the narrative of globalization, because we think that globalization has lost its its course or is going in a direction that we don't like. It's not good for the majority of people. It's not good for the planet, and it's not good for peace, as we can see recently, in addition to sustainability and resilience. So we have to change direction. We're trying to create a new narrative of hope, but to generate this rather than create it from scratch, but to generate it, to make it emerge out of our contexts and our projects. So we deal with UN reform. Many of us at Fox are former UN staff, and we still feel very strongly. We think like international civil servants, even outside the context of the UN, but not as bureaucrats. So we have a UN reform. We propose the creation of Global Resilience Council for non-military threats to human security. We propose the rethinking of education to improve the judgment of people and to enable them also to use digital and other means to tell bad from good and to give themselves agency to influence things. We want to also foster responsible democratic citizenship. We want the military assets to be used for to respond to non-military emergencies like floods or fires that are caused by climate change or made worse because of climate change. So we have projects on all of these things on ourselves or with partners. And Katoikos.world is our online magazine. So that was an overview of what we do as a think and do tank. Just to tell you an anecdote from my own life, I never wanted to become a diplomat when I was growing up many years ago, because I thought, I don't want to make photocopies for ambassadors when I'm younger. Then I don't want to wear suits all the time, maybe. And I want to be original in my thinking. And I think that the diplomat is not supposed to be, or not to show it. But at the same time, I'm scared now when I see that there is a lack of diplomats, because it goes with a lack of diplomacy. I mean, everybody thinks that they're right and they start a war or impose sanctions or do this or that. And we do need diplomats, and we do need people who can bridge gaps, etc. And so I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yogos. Next, I think we have Fortney explaining the paper. So over to you, Fortney and Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Manon. Also, thank you, Yorgos, for hosting our paper, our research with Elizabeth. Again, I apologize on her behalf, but she will be present by the chat function, of course, during the questions and answer session. And of course, thank you to Marcus and Mary for participating in this panel. I really look forward to hearing your interventions after we present what is it all about. So it's just, as Yorgos just said, without diplomats, there is no diplomacy. And this is a popular slogan that's going on around in diplomatic circles, even within ministers of foreign affairs in Europe and even globally. But nobody has actually gone into depth to examine what exactly is they're missing. So are we missing diplomats, or are we missing proactive foreign policies or proactive diplomacy on a national or a global level? So because of this a problem going on in several countries, we decided to see what this shortage is, what drives it, particularly regarding youth, what are its consequences for foreign policy and for diplomacy in general, and how can policymakers and ministries themselves address it and perhaps tackle it. So going into starting from the term itself, actually, the way we understand the diplomatic shortage through this paper is an original way. Of course, we coined the term in an original sense. There are some mentions here and there in some accounts, mostly journalistic accounts, of staffing shortages or diplomatic deficits, particularly in Indian and British diplomacy, but they refer to something very, very specific, so very unidimensional, and not exactly what we're trying to talk about today, in a more holistic understanding of the problem. So this more holistic understanding refers to the diplomatic shortage as a shortage of personnel, as a shortage of diplomatic personnel, which means that their current diplomats are resigning, but also that there is a decreasing or low interest for new candidates to join and also for new hires. But at the same time, there's also a shortage of resources other than human, which mostly refers to budgets for foreign policy, for ministers of foreign affairs, but also to other kind of material that diplomacy is it's using in its daily activities. So there is both a quantity and a quality shortage. The quantity side referring to the actual lack of resources, human and material. So there's also a material and a more ideational aspect of the shortage. And the quality shortage refers to the effect on foreign policy and on diplomacy that this lack of resources has. So without resources, without people, diplomats cannot act effectively or cannot act in a specific way. But it also refers to the maladaptation of modern diplomacy to the changes in the international relations sphere just because of the shortage. Going into the driving factors of the shortage, there is a supply and a demand side, meaning that the shortage is driven both from a lack of demand for diplomats on the side of ministries, but also from a lack of supply of diplomats, so from the side of potential qualified candidates. These two categories of supply and demand factors refer to both policy-oriented regions, society-oriented regions, and regions referring to the actual individual preferences of potential candidates, but we will go that in a bit. So less diplomats and less material resources means that ministers of foreign affairs worldwide are struggling to cover costs, are overburdening their personnel, even to the extreme extent that in 2023, 3 or 4, if I'm not mistaken, diplomats of the Czech Republic actually died because of overexhaustion, 2 of them because of a heart attack, because of overburdening themselves, because of lack of personnel and lack of resources in their posts. More details have not been actually published by the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it is a very interesting case in point, and it really made the headlines when it happened. Of course, because of the shortage, ministries and countries themselves are actually not able to match their foreign policy goals with what they can do in physical and practical terms because of lack of personnel. And a case in point is India, which is internationally trying to be more assertive in its foreign policy, but it has severe diplomatic staff shortage. So gaining all this information on the concept of the diplomatic shortage, we tried to do a literature review, and we tried to find information regarding what is driving the shortage. So we came up with this graph, and I would like to ask Elizabeth to share her screen with the graph, so as it's easier to follow what I will be saying. Regarding the demand and the supply side factors that drive the shortage. So on the demand side, there are a variety of reasons referring to political, administrative, or socioeconomic factors. Starting from the political reasons, of course, we understand that every country has specific policy priorities, with relations with country X being more important than relations with country Y, or with relations with country Z not being existent at all. So, of course, an embassy or a consulate with this country will not exist. Or if a country does not have a specific, an important number of its nationals residing in another country, they will not need a consulate there. So policy priorities in this respect for interstate relations, of course, factor into how many embassies does a country have, how many people they need, what kind of expertise should these people have. But of course, this is, again, not absolute. So you can have interest in a particular country, but have a very big embassy there, or the complete opposite. And of course, this is connected with logistics in terms of like material resources, the buildings of embassies, consulates, number of posting, budget, and so on. On the second side, like going into the administrative factors, we have a specific rise in nepotism-based hires and the rise in political appointees, so not career diplomats. And this might sound like something that happens mostly in autocratic or kind of dictatorial or authoritarian regimes, but unfortunately it's not. It was the case in an autocratic regime of Afghanistan, where for more than 20 years, diplomatic posts were occupied by people who were not qualified to be diplomats, but were just either political affiliates or friends or family members of the people in power. But we see the same problem in democratic states, and even in Europe. Just to give an example from the latest years, where Poland passed a decree in 2021 that basically disbanded the diplomatic corps of Poland and rendered every diplomat a political appointee. with opaque hiring processes, with like lack of clarifications on how the hiring process proceeds with, and what qualifications should a person during their studies or professional experience should gain in order to reach the point of being able to be selected for such a position. Similar situation happened in France, actually, where in 2022, Macron passed a decree that basically dismantled the French diplomatic corps, which, to be fair, was quite small, like just 700 people for France with such a global diplomatic footprint. That's quite interesting to note. But similar situations have also happened in Lithuania, in Australia, and of course in the US under the Trump administration, which saw a record number of resignations, but also a record number of political appointees with opaque hiring processes. Going into the administrative factors even deeper, of course, as I mentioned, budget cuts, which also reflect policy priorities, are a very big thing for driving the diplomatic shortage, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. And Greece is actually a case in point, because during the decades-long financial and economic crisis in the country, the budget for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was reduced quite substantially. There were several years where a diplomatic exam did not take place because the public sector was not able to fund more positions, even though the country's foreign policy had needs in terms of positions to be filled. And at the same time, Greece saw several protests by its current diplomatic personnel in the past years regarding the decrease in their salaries, and also the merging of the let's say the portfolio that diplomats have to do to encompass beyond political but also economic and trade relations, but in one position. Of course, recessions, as I said as well, are affecting budget cuts and budget priorities in every state. That's a given. Moving on, there are also socioeconomic factors that drive the shortage on this side of the graph. And the most important thing that, of course, is on everybody's mind is technological developments. With the rise of technology, new forms of diplomacy have come into play, mostly digital diplomacy, but also the aspect of the human diplomat being replaced by artificial intelligence tools. Something very interesting that Elizabeth was kind to share with us is that Meta, the company which owns Facebook and Instagram, has developed an artificial intelligence tool, which is called Cicero, that actually beats humans in the online and board game of diplomacy, which is something very interesting to note. Of course, real life diplomacy is not the same as this board or online game, but at the same time, it's concerning that some aspects of the diplomat's job can actually be automated using IR tools. On the other hand, not everything that a human diplomat can do can be automated. And just to mention some of the diplomatic lingo, corridor diplomacy or coffee or whiskey diplomacy, which refers to human interaction, unofficial discussions or relations, cannot easily be automated, but tasks like speech writing or report writing or monitoring developments can easily be automated through tools like OpenAI, Sora, ChatGPT, or so on. But of course, we can go more into the technology aspect in the Q&A. And in general, this has given rise to new forms of diplomacy, but going beyond digital diplomacy, we also have the concept of citizen diplomacy, public diplomacy, civil society diplomacy, people-to-people connections. And this brings me to the supply side, because all these new forms of diplomacy, new ways of producing diplomacy and affecting foreign policy are also creating new kinds of professional development for people to choose from. So going to the supply side, there is a low decreasing interest of qualified potential candidates to become diplomats. But why is that? As I mentioned, one of the first reasons is the fact that there are more international relations affair jobs nowadays. We have think tanks, we have consulting, we have non-governmental organizations, we have external relations positions in multinational companies that can be dealing with literally anything from trade to journalistic companies or so on. Sometimes these positions in the private sector might be even more lucrative than the diplomatic sector, of course, in light of budget cuts, which makes them more appealing. but also they might offer more flexibility in terms of where a person is being posted. While in comparison, when a person joins the diplomatic corps, they don't usually have a say, or they have a say, but up to a certain extent on where will they be posted. This is a political decision that's being decided on the government level. Of course, taking into consideration the person's, or it should at least, the person's qualifications and interests. Moreover, there is another wider opportunity and an information gap that are both driving the shortage. What I mean by this, and this is connected with a general, let's say, prejudice that the diplomatic profession is quite elitist, because the hiring process for the diplomatic sector usually refers to either an exam-based system or an interviews-based system, but it also refers to certain requirements, usually higher education degrees, foreign languages, some kind of professional experience, usually some kind of lived experience abroad as well, which all translate into a very specific and either smaller or larger, depending on the country, pool of people that have the financial and the practical ability to do all these things. So the pool of the qualified candidates is actually smaller than everybody who could potentially be interested in the diplomatic field. And the information gap is actually, it sounds like a paradox in the age of the 21st century and internet and information available everywhere. But of course, we cannot overlook the fact that in rural or underdeveloped areas, or in areas that are quite, or in countries that are quite centralized, but on the periphery of the states, there's lack of information on the public sector jobs, especially in the diplomatic field. So this, of course, is affecting how much people are aware of the diplomatic profession. Turning now to personal preferences, this is also a very important aspect driving the shortage. And actually, our findings that I will go into a bit later prove that nowadays young people are more interested in a work-life balance that is more clear than in the past. So these personal preferences concern how the safety concerns of the diplomatic profession and also the personal life hurdles of the diplomatic profession are being perceived by potential candidates. And this includes security concerns because the position might be posted in a conflict zone, or it is generally, it puts a person into security risk because of the country that they're working for. And while personal life hurdles include the difficulty of maintaining a family, or providing quality education to a diplomat's children, or finding an adequate professional occupation for the spouse of a diplomat who happens to not be a diplomat, and so on. So these are all things that are noted as concerns by young people for joining the diplomatic sector. Moving on and going into the actual content of the diplomatic profession, the strict hierarchy that it involves is also cited a lot of times by people, especially young people, as a demotivator. However, on the other hand, we should note that the grass is not always greener on the other side. In the private sector as well, you will always have a boss, and you will always have to follow KPIs and objectives and guidelines. So this is not completely accurate, to say the least. Of course, people are also in disagreement with specific foreign policy priorities of a particular government, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they are not able or willing to join the diplomatic sector. They might wait until the government changes, or they might, if they're current diplomats, they might just stay patient and not resign. But some people can also resign if the disagreement is quite huge. Furthermore, like bureaucracy within MFAs and generally the public sector, which is infamous for its red tape, and a strong path dependency and sticking to concrete and well-known procedures are also cited as key demotivators. So young people, and generally people in the workforce in the modern day, they want their work environment to be up to date with the developments in the job market, in technology, and in new ways of organizing work. So sticking to old, in brackets, I'm not like quoting an ageistic approach here, but sticking to old procedures based on path dependency is seen as a demotivator. Two last reasons here on the supply side have to do with corruption and nepotism. Corruption, even in democratic states that are cracked down by populist rules or corrupted leaders, of course, have created a general distrust towards the public sector, especially among youth. But on the other hand, we cannot talk about youth political apathy as a demotivator for joining the diplomatic sector, because youth are so active in terms of political and civic engagement. And Mary can also intervene later on with some comments on this. So corruption is noted as both a demotivator, that I don't want to be a member of a public sector that is enmeshed in a corrupted system of who is getting hired, who is getting promoted, how things are done. But on the other hand, is also cited as a motivator to change things from the inside, especially from a youth that is very active in civic and political terms. And nepotism is also cited as another reason, connected, of course, to corruption. And it is cited as both referring to the hiring processes, usually the exam-based systems that are sometimes opaque, or also to the hiring processes of political appointees, as I mentioned before. But it's also mentioned as a misconception that generally the diplomatic sector is affected by nepotism. So sometimes it does have to do with reality when we're talking about opaque hiring processes, but sometimes it's just a misconception in the mind of people that are not completely informed about how the diplomatic hiring process is moving on. Okay, having all this into consideration, we proceeded with 33 interviews with young people, current diplomats, and professors of international relations and public policy. And basically, our findings actually confirmed what the literature and the general discussion showcased, as I just presented. We found that a lot of young people are in fact interested in diplomacy, which is of course connected to the fact that our sample was quite biased. Only 3 out of 24 people said that they were not interested in diplomacy. But I should note that diplomacy here was defined in a more general term, concerning also tangential paths, such as working for an international organization or a non-governmental organization, which is connected to the more paths of producing diplomacy. But the concept of diplomatic shortage refers to national diplomatic positions. Secondly, we also found that interviewees, young people, did not necessarily feel the sense of purpose of serving their country as the key motivator for joining the diplomatic sector, even though that the current diplomats we interviewed mentioned that this was the most important reason someone should join the diplomatic profession. And I think this is also connected to the fact that for the people who were interested in diplomacy, there were 2 trends. Either these people were interested in the diplomatic and international affairs field from the beginning of their, let's say, career building process, through gradual steps of studies, conferences, languages, international experience, and so on, or they decided after they came into personal contact with current diplomats or people working in the different kinds of diplomacy paths that I just mentioned, think tanks, academia, consulting, and so on. And then they decided that I want this or I don't want this. But we can go more into these 2 trends, of course, in the Q&A. Then we found that there are several obstacles to joining the diplomatic sector, which correspond to the reasons I mentioned before, either referring to the ministries themselves and to policy in general, or referring to personal preferences. As I mentioned, the archaic entrance exams or hiring processes, corruption, nepotism, bureaucracy, cutthroat atmosphere, or strict hierarchy, and of course the security concerns and the personal life concerns of people. Lastly, while many of the youth that we interviewed, 6 out of 24, said that they don't think that there is a diplomatic shortage globally, 10 said that they did, and the rest did not respond. So we found that to be an interesting number. Also, what we found interesting was that all professors that we interviewed actually confirmed that most of their students were interested in diplomacy, but not in joining the diplomatic sector of their countries. One professor said that about 50% of their students want to become diplomats, but they will not try to do that through their national diplomatic sector, while another one said that around 2/3 of their students go into consulting after graduating. So all these findings basically boil down to some policy recommendations, which start and not end and don't end on reforming the hiring process of ministries of foreign affairs. starting with reforming the knowledge and the skill set needed to join the diplomatic sector, and of course the format of this hiring process. Either it's an entrance exam or is it an interview-based process. All these processes should reflect the needs of the job market in international affairs today, but also the knowledge and the new developments in this market. In addition, addressing concerns of gender equality or of the personal life hurdles and the work-life balance within the profession is also needed based on what the potential candidates are thinking. But I will go more into the aspect of potential candidates in 1 minute. Moreover, of course, for current diplomats, because the shortage also involves resignations, it is important to allow them to come forward with their expertise in a region, in a country, in a conflict, on a topic, and to allow them to express their professional opinion, irrespective of whether this would be the approach that would be adopted or so on. So current diplomats are calling for more, let's say, space to be heard and to contribute to the policymaking process. Furthermore, of course, ministries should fully embrace modern socioeconomic developments, mostly focusing on AI tools and also on public diplomacy, which involves the people-to-people aspect as well. And of course, foreign ministries should match their will for an assertive and proactive foreign policy with the adequate resources, financial and material, to back this up, so as to keep their diplomats basically alive and not burnt out. Because if you don't have alive, yes, we all understand what that means, but if you don't have a well-functioning and rested diplomats working on such important topics, then the foreign policy output is not efficient. But as we also said, the diplomatic shortage does not only concern the ministries, but it also concerns the potential candidates. And this is an aspect that is usually overlooked because, of course, we understand that people nowadays might have more priorities for a work-life balance or that are more concerned for the security aspect of a diplomatic profession. But at the same time, we cannot judge diplomatic profession for its quintessential elements. There are some of these elements exist in the private sector as well. There's not always a work-life balance. Security concerns exist there. Strict hierarchy exists in the private sector as well. So some of these things can be ameliorated through better and less opaque procedures within ministries. But of course, we cannot judge the diplomatic profession for its quintessential elements. You are representing a country, and of course, you might be in a security in a less secure situation because of that. And lastly, candidates should be fully informed about what a diplomat's work is and should get rid of misconceptions about nepotism or lack of merit in exam processes. Of course, potential candidates are welcome to have different priorities, but there needs to be a stronger and more informed approach to joining the diplomatic sector or not. These were just, sorry it took a long time, but I wanted to go through everything so as we have food for thought for the discussion. I really look forward to Marcus and Mary for their comments.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Professor, please go ahead. I was just about to ask you for your initial remarks on the paper. Yeah.
Yes. No, thank you very much. First of all, thanks a lot to Fox for inviting me to this discussion. Very happy, obviously, to discuss a brilliant paper written by two of my former students. And not only because of that, I'll be very generous in my remarks. I mean, it really is an excellent paper, and I think if you wanted to pursue publishing it in a scholarly journal, Hague Journal of Diplomacy, global governance, I mean, I think they would be very interested in it. Yeah. I want to do three things now. First, I want to contextualize a little bit what you said, thinking in terms of eras of diplomacy. Second, then I want to highlight a few points that you made, simply really just to underline them, because they're very congruent with my observations. And the third one, looking a little bit at the implications of what you have said. So first one, contextualizing it. When when we Cornelia Biola, my co-author on diplomacy in many ways, when we wrote our first textbook on diplomacy, then we weren't quite sure about how to title it. So our hunch was there was something, we were in the midst of a transition between international or interstate diplomacy and global diplomacy. So our hunch, something like 15 years ago or something like that, was okay. So diplomacy is actually going to become more and more important. Yeah. But not necessarily the kind of diplomacy, so from the 1990s onwards, as we had always been grown accustomed to. Yeah. So self-evidently, most people, of course, when they think of diplomacy, then they think of foreign ministries. And of course, according to the Vienna Convention, diplomatic relations and everything, the definition of a diplomat, legally speaking, is very narrow. But then came with the financial crisis, of course, there came the finance ministries, and before that already there came the environmental ministries and the trade ministries and the defense ministries and so on and so forth. So there was this multiplication of actors on the diplomatic stage, yeah. And this multiplication sometimes put foreign ministries, so diplomacy as traditionally conceived, a little bit into the back seat, yeah. So if we look at environmental negotiations, let's say on plastic that's going on now, then many states, they don't send their representatives from the foreign ministry anymore, but from the environmental ministry or others. I think that is one thing that, especially from the 1990s onwards, this multiplication of actors, that is something that did something to diplomacy. And in our days, and that's probably from the 2010s or so onwards, there's definitely a move to, I mean, not in every country, but there are definitely tendencies towards a populist diplomacy. And Elizabeth Fortini, that came out, I think, very well in your talk as well, yeah. And that obviously has massive repercussions for diplomacy, and we saw that very clearly with the Trump years. And you start your paper there with something, yeah. Populism directs itself against the establishment. And career diplomats are very much considered to be the establishment. So they are the enemy. Yeah, they are the ones who are supposed to be sidelined, alienated, and so on and so forth. And that obviously has very adverse effects for diplomacy. So I think if we contextualize what you write in this way, then we arrive at a picture that makes it actually quite logical what you write about. Yeah. And in a way, there are challenges of facing, especially foreign ministries. Yeah. They come from two different sides. Yeah. So there's on the one hand, this differentiation, division of labor. More and more complexity, the generalists in the foreign ministry not necessarily always very well trained to handle that, and on the other hand, there's the populist challenge, yeah, and both actually are challenges for diplomacy traditionally conceived. Second one, just to highlight a few comments that you make, yeah. Political appointees, yeah, that obviously is a massive drawback. I always wonder about it, yeah. I don't know whether I should mention certain countries now, but I find it amazing how some states, because of their political appointees, weaken their position internationally tremendously, yeah. Because these political appointees are often not properly trained. They can be actually rather clueless, can be very clumsy, and they can be very, very ill-suited to represent the national interest, which they're actually supposed to do. Of course, this has then repercussions for career diplomats, yeah, and And from my discussions, I mean, there's an oftentimes with people who are already in ministries, there's a huge dissatisfaction that there is this glass ceiling that they reach and they can't go beyond that. Technological developments. I think that's a very, very important point. Yeah, and I'm going to go back to that then with the implications. New forms of diplomacy, as you put it. Yeah. Those obviously are challenges, yeah, because so in our days you are supposed to be really good at writing reports back home on all kinds of things happening, including technological innovation and everything. Perhaps you're, I don't know, a tech diplomat posted somewhere to San Francisco, and then suddenly you're supposed to know all of that. At the same time, you're supposed to diffuse messages. You're supposed to do public diplomacy via social media channels. And plus, of course, you're supposed to do the usual work that diplomats have always done. Yeah. And I think Fatini, you're quite right. I mean, and sometimes then exhaustion and simply complete overwork kicks in. Another one that I want to highlight just from my experience with students is that the how did I put that? So oftentimes the very, very good students, they don't want to go into diplomacy. That's my experience. Yeah. So at least here in Vienna, they're oftentimes their dream destination is an international organization, but not a foreign ministry. And I think it seems to be that there's a certain that they really want to keep on thinking independently. Whether they always can do that in an international organization, I have my doubts. It's not always easy either. But I think that's the perception. I think which also explains why quite a few students are interested in going into think tanks and all. And then finally about the implications. What are the implications of what you write? Yeah, and so we definitely are in an in-between era. So there are lots and lots of new challenges, and diplomacy has to adapt to them. Technology is one part of that. Yeah. So in terms of these challenges, on the one hand, there's more and more specialization necessary. Yeah. So if I want to be able now to say something meaningful, negotiating the digital global compact, then I need to know quite a lot of things about this digital. Or if I want to be able to negotiate meaningfully anything on arms control, autonomous, semi-autonomous weapons, for instance, then I need to know a lot about these digital things, and in particular artificial intelligence. And so there's a lot of specialization, yeah, and one could make the same argument now with the environment and with health and what have you. So that is already a big challenge for diplomats who are trained to be generalists, yeah. And the other big challenge is to put all of these pieces of the puzzle back together. So to have something like a grand strategy, so that the state knows what to do in international affairs. And I think I think there are serious deficits on both sides. Yeah. So there's serious deficits on the specialization on the one hand, and there are serious deficits in putting back all of these pieces together. And that begs then the question about how you're supposed to train a diplomat in our days, or who should enter a diplomatic service. Yeah. I think it would be great. So if let's say it would be quite normal for someone who graduates from a technical discipline, somewhere from the sciences, to consider a diplomatic career. Yeah. So that's very unusual, highly unusual. which would mean, amongst other things, probably that these entry exams, they would have to be revisited. So maybe sometimes a language less, and the technological skill more, something along those lines. And I think something that also can work quite well is to make it more possible for people to move in and out. So I'm not saying to abandon these entry exams. I think they're very, very important. But I think once they're in the service, it's actually quite good if they venture out a little bit, if they work in a think tank, if they work somewhere in a foundation in the vicinity of a tech company or what have you, and then they come back. So it's all experience that I think is needed for the diplomatic service. So in short, I fully agree with your diagnosis of the shortage of diplomats. And I fully agree with what Giorgio said at the very beginning. So in order to have diplomacy, you need diplomats. But the kind of diplomacy that we need nowadays is probably a little different from how it was 50 years ago, and not even want to say 100 years ago or longer. And so if one wants to make young people enthusiastic again for joining the diplomatic service, then I think one has to reshuffle a few things with this diplomatic service.
Thank you, Marcus. Okay. Thank you. I think I'll go next to Mary. If you can share your comments on this.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations to both Elizabeth and to Fotini, and also thank you, Marcus, for this input. I would like to comment on all of it because so many interesting points have been heard. I want to start with what Marcus said. He talked about changing the criteria of how to enter the diplomatic corps, and I totally agree. And also giving the possibility to be more flexible, to move in and out. I'm a person who wanted to be a diplomat ever since I remember myself at school, but I also remember being very much discouraged by my own family. I remember my father saying, this is a very solitary profession. You would never find a partner to be with you in all these different countries. And even if you manage to find someone to follow you, then you would have a family, and then your children would hate you for having to move them every 4 years, for example. And this really stuck in my mind. And as a woman, let's say the gender factor and the role that society and my family expect of me was very much, let's say, rigid and actually very critical towards my decisions later in life. Now, Fotini was talking a bit about, different kinds of diplomacy, and even she compared, the dominance of technology with a human factor and things that technology, let's say, cannot take over. So you mentioned even, let's say, corridor diplomacy or cocktail diplomacy. So I have this tendency every morning I get up early and I just listen to the news in different languages and different channels. So yesterday morning, I was listening to the Greek news and then the Turkish news, and the headlines were about döner diplomacy in the context of the visit of the German president to Istanbul. And he brought with him 60 kilos of döner, and he actually organized the soiree for all the officials, treating them döner and also cutting döner. And this is the way he wanted, let's say, to show the bilateral relations between Turkey and Germany. So by some, this was, let's say, commented in a positive way. By others, it was very much criticized because they, let's say, emphasize how stereotypical this portrayal of relations is. But at the end of the day, for me, it was a positive surprise to see this kind of, diplomatic gesture being analyzed through different media and through different people, and actually pointing, the emphasis and the light on the face of the diplomat, and just showing how important it is to contribute in a way that might be, I don't know, for some stereotypical, for others it might be creative. So this made me think the following, that in your paper, in your study, I came across 3 or 4 times this phrase, which is allergy to change. And I think that this is something that I have seen working many years, for and with organizations and governments. An allergy to change in the sense of, not wanting to change the system, how things are working, not wanting to change, let's say, the strategy, which might be the way we do things, or even our outreach strategy, or the way we try to implement certain models and our expectations. But even when it comes, to a national level, a change in the way we see our interests, that these are our interests and they're very rigid and they don't change, and this is our position and this is our image to the world. Well, is it really such, a rigid way of portraying things? My personal drive in coming into this world, let's say, of international organizations and think tanks and working with governments and NGOs had very much to do with contributing to social change, being a part of it. So this for me would pose a question of, do I work with governments and organizations or for them? And this small preposition, the with or for, made a huge difference in terms of flexibility, as you very well noted. Freedom, because freedom for me meant that, for example, when you work with an organization, you you have more space, let's say, to take initiative, because you are a partner, you're not necessarily a staff member, so you can even somehow overcome all these hierarchies that we talk about. But also, being an academic, for me, for example, it was very important to be able to write, to publish, to have a voice, to attend certain events that I couldn't when I was working for an organization. So for me, this was a dilemma. It was a very conscious choice to work mainly with governments and organizations. The other day, I was listening to this series of podcasts by the London University. It's a series called "What Are the Traits of a Good Diplomat?" or "What Makes a Good Diplomat?" And over the time, there are interviews, with ambassadors, with attachés, with different kind of people. And I would take notes, from now and then, doing housework and just listening to this, I would take notes. And there were some things like, there were 4 things which were common among these interviews, and they were the following. So a good diplomat has to be creative and flexible. They have to be patient. They have to know very well the context of the region they're going to work on. And they also need to have a sense of humor. And this doesn't always coincide with the criteria posed by governments on how to enter the diplomatic corps and how to be accepted as a diplomat. For example, in Greece, you have this huge reading list that you need, let's say, to learn, to memorize. And I remember that I was always very much discouraged by the following. I would say that if I really, really try, because I'm a bookworm as well, I can pass, let's say, history and maybe law and geography, but what about maritime law? Now, this one really scared me. And then I was coming to think that, do we really learn through this reading list to be creative? Do we really learn to be patient or to be flexible? Or how do we define humor, in a good sense of humor that will not put us, in a dangerous situation or will not jeopardize bilateral relations? So this brings me also to the conclusion that yes, we need to change the criteria as well, but also there are different ways of doing diplomacy. Personally, I chose public diplomacy. I chose citizen diplomacy with the credo that change can start from the neighborhood. It can start from the context you're working in. So I think that there are different routes to be explored and different ways, let's say, to be an active citizens first and then contribute to diplomacy, let's say, in dynamic terms. And I think that governments should be more open to embracing the change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I think on your point about whether you're working for the government or with the government, what I think there is that it depends on what your perspective is. Are you working for the government or for the state? If you're working for the state or like a nation as large, then yes, you're working in partnership with the government and representing people at large. But of course, not every government is democratic, so I don't know how it really turns up there. Maybe Georgios has some comment on this, and Georgios can share some other views on the paper itself. Georgios, yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Manan. Many thanks to Marcus and Mary for their personal take of the paper, and of course to the two authors. There is so much to talk about. For me, what Mary said about working for or with rather is very important. I always felt that the UN, and Marcus alluded to that, are you freer in a big organization like the UN if you go there? For me, my sense of duty and sense of what is good and what is right and what's wrong was closer to the UN cosmopolitan identity than working for my country and talking against the enemies of the country, even if, right, I do worry about my country and its people, but it's not my natural disposition to complain about this all the time. So at the UN, yes, I felt freer because I was closer to my ideals. And having also my PhD, etc., I felt I was working with the UN because I had already my formed views. I did my PhD on UN reform, so I didn't feel I was just asked to do things, but I was contributing to the formulation of policies. And I was lucky enough to work with Kofi Annan in his office and with people who were open and encouraging such contributions. And I think the best of the UN, perhaps of diplomatic services, was when there was also an intellectual capacity of idea generation and not just marching orders of, you do this and you say that. So, yeah, I mean, it can be made much more interesting, I think, diplomacy, but for national partial positions, either it changes and be more inclusive and I think more accommodating to people's multiple interests, or it has to be very rather sterile and then it should go to the Ministry of Defense. I don't know what, but thanks.
Okay. And also from the paper, I had there were two special cases. One is the EU, where the presence of EU is increasing, and whereas the nations which constitute EU, they are reducing, the diplomats that they have. And the other another exception to this was China. We've seen that China is actually having more diplomats. And so, what exactly are they doing right? Fortini, maybe you can tell us from your research or just open to all the panelists, is there a lesson for other countries to learn from here?
Of course, as I briefly mentioned, and I think also what Marcus said about the changing environment of international relations. So the balance of power in between the big powers and their diplomatic capacities and their foreign policy assertiveness or presence is changing. That's quite visible. US is losing power internationally. It's a political capital, even in financial capital. China is gaining in the financial capital for sure, and the political capital with some partners. We've got Russia's political and financial capital being on a precarious situation right now because of the war with the Ukraine and the global sanctions regime and so on. So things are changing in the international sphere. What China has been doing quite successfully for the past decades, and actually, as I said, I don't remember if I mentioned it, but in 2021, China surpassed the US in terms of its global diplomatic presence, in terms of postings, embassies, and consulates abroad, which is something very, very interesting to note. And it's, of course, it's not only connected to the political aspect, it's connected to the trade aspect, because embassies and consulates are also concerned, also work on trade relations with the country that they're posted at. So of course China is opting more for that to achieve better political presence as well. So what is China doing is matching its foreign policy assertiveness goal with the resources that it is offering to its diplomatic sector. So more embassies means more people. Of course, we're talking about quite an autocratic regime. So the process of hiring people for these positions, even if there are a lot of positions available, is quite opaque. We did, of course, it was not China was not a case study in our research, and this could have been a very interesting approach to follow for a future paper. But when we were presenting it as an example, I remember I was trying to find information on how are Chinese diplomats hired. And almost nothing existed, or it was quite outdated, or there were just some comments in some blog posts for potential candidates on how to prepare, what to study, but again, it was not clear on how people were selected. But if we're talking about the policy level and policy priorities, that we want to be more active politically, globally, so we will invest in more money going to our Minister of Foreign Affairs, to our public diplomacy, specifically into our trade diplomacy, see Belt and Road Initiative and so on, all the trade negotiations that China has with countries, especially in Africa, and of course, more material resources. On the EU aspect, and of course, and maybe the other panelists want to intervene in both the EU and China, what is being monitored, and there's like a few research papers on this, is that the national diplomatic corps of like specific EU member state countries, I think Italy, Germany, Austria might be in there as well, and France, following the decree that I mentioned by President Macron, their national diplomatic corps are either decreasing or they're very stable. In comparison to their foreign policy goals, which are more or less stable, let's say right now, but their diplomatic footprint is decreasing. At the same time, when the EU diplomatic footprint with the EU delegations is increasing. So there is a trend in decreasing national member states' diplomatic footprint with an increasing EU delegations footprint. But of course, this is generally connected to the wider discussion of common foreign and security policy and common security and defense policy in the EU, which is a very big aspect. But there are cases of co-location, so where EU delegations are hosting also the foreign representation of EU member states in the country that they're posted. So an EU member state does not have its own embassy, but it's using the EU delegation in country X to represent its bilateral relations with that country. So this can happen in cases where the member state does not really have a policy priority to have very strong bilateral political relations with that country, but the EU as EU has some kind of like a political commitment or cooperation with that country. So there is a co-location, both the EU level and the member state are being represented in the same, let's say, space, not from the same people, because of course you would always have a national diplomat there, but it could be one person, could be a person who's not posted permanently. So these are the two issues with EU and China.
Thank you. I think we're already above time, but it's okay. We can continue for 5-10 minutes more. Marcus or Maddie or Georges, anything on you want to add to this?
I could, I mean, a few, because it's a very good question, yeah, because it's basically it's a question whether the table that we have on the paper and that Fontini also showed to us, whether that's applicable to any kind of diplomatic service, yeah, and I think up to a point it is, but some of the I think some of the indicators or the causes that the authors identified, they're a little different. I mean, let's say if we look at China, then it is definitely very hierarchical, and there are loads of political appointees. And China would actually be this a case for me where career diplomats are actually very well trained, but when the political appointees come in, especially those high ranking in the foreign ministries and travel abroad and everything, they, let me put it mildly, in terms of their public diplomacy and everything, is not always up to scratch. Yeah, so I think some of the problems that the authors point out are quite pronounced in the Chinese Foreign Service as well. Others less so, and I agree with Fontini. So there's definitely in terms of resources and everything, it looks much better. Yeah? Perhaps there's one anecdote about this, right? So when the short-lived spokesperson of the Chinese foreign minister spoke about a wolf warrior diplomacy, yeah, that is really it was a public relations disaster, yeah, because this is being used over and over and over again now. So basically, as an indicator, a marker, going from one form of Chinese diplomacy, a rather quiet one, accommodating one, to a much more assertive one. Yeah. So an example that it's not always that fantastic with these political appointees, and he didn't make it for long as a spokesperson.
We have questions from the audience also, right? Or comments, or Mary wants perhaps to make a comment and then, right? So there have been some comments in the chat, right? And some discussions. I don't know, Manan, if you want to review them.
Yes,
Or...
I'm actually just going through it, but I think Elizabeth and Fortini have actually responded to some of them. So, do you
So
have
I see that there is one last question that's unanswered yet. It says that our article is titled "Running Out of Diplomats." If we're running out of time, if there is a critical level for that, I mean, it's in research terms you cannot quantify that, of course, but if I'm allowed to say that, I think we've already run out of time. There is the shortage exists. There are countries facing severe problems with staffing their diplomatic corps. They're facing like deaths of diplomats from overworking. They're probably facing reduced or weak diplomatic impact compared to what they would like to have achieved, of course. And then on the other side, we're facing a public perception, especially among young people, that the diplomatic sector is perhaps not interesting anymore, it's not lucrative anymore, it's not attractive anymore. So that's a loss for diplomacy as well in terms of its public perception of what it is. So in this respect, yes, we're out of time. And of course, it's high time that a lot of things have changed. As Mary just said, this allergy to change should change. So in this respect, that would be my response. But of course, I mean, in practical terms of like the number of diplomats, it was more of a play with words.
Okay, I think that's all questions that we have. Yes, Jorgos.
To put another element that I think Fotini also mentioned, and it's mentioned in the paper, is the overall undermining of the public sector vis-a-vis the private sector, even in democracies. And perhaps diplomacy is shows it par excellence because it was a representation of the state outside, but even within. So the establishment or whatever was mentioned before. So this thing about we need to rebuild the state as the stable thing that works for the common interest, not the deep state or the state, big brother state, but the state that really offers the infrastructure of a society for it to function. And I think that's also, an indication of now it's more about making money in the private sector. Everything is done better by the private sector. But with it goes also the sense of common good and duty. So, I mean, for me, the diplomats can be really painfully rigid sometimes or whatever at the UN when I used to work with them. At the same time, I would respect their representation of the common interest of their country. Now, if you don't have people to express that or even have processes to formulate that other than the politics of the day in a certain country, there is an issue. And it shows in international relations also when from one day to the next, let's say the attitude of a big country like the US might change towards a big conflict or towards another country or towards a big issue. That is something unpredictable that really makes things worse, I think, and more precarious in international affairs in general. Thanks.
Okay, and I think so. I would like to ask Mary one thing, which is about the youth civic and political activism. Perhaps you can share some insights on that.
So I come from a country which is the only country in the wider region in Southeastern Europe which doesn't have a ministry dedicated to youth. I'm also a person who's very much passionate about the Balkans. So as a young person living in Greece, which I considered, especially in Thessaloniki, which is northern Greece, so it's very much in the heart of the Balkans, the drive for me to be more, let's say, publicly engaged and discover this field of public or citizen diplomacy had to do with changing things in my reality. So the first thing for me would be to try to galvanize young people into my community first and into the region, into building bilateral relations between different economies, especially in situations of frozen conflict or minimal relations. So, for example, a big part of my work had to do with Kosovo. I could never understand why we didn't have, let's say, more meaningful relations with Kosovo throughout the previous years, in the sense that we were never in direct conflict with each other. And especially from Thessaloniki, it's so close. I could never understand why there wasn't a bus that goes directly, let's say, from Thessaloniki to Pristina, and why, although we had so many Kosovar students who would study in Thessaloniki. For example, I did this big research which showed that at the time of the research, which was in 2018, 2019, we had 100 Kosovar young people in Thessaloniki only who contributed a lot, financially, culturally, name it. So for me, I started with conducting a research on changing the image and the narrative. Through what way? I wanted to understand, first of all, how do Kosovars see us as Greeks? Because I realized that many times they would see us as the enemy. Although, as I said, we're never in direct conflict, but there were very different understandings and interpretations of what happened during the Yugoslav tragedy. Then I would try to understand why Greeks still have a very obsolete image of Kosovo, connected very much with trauma, something which is not true anymore. I think that the work that has been done contributed significantly to where we are today. One of the things that I worked with Fotini on, and I think it's worth mentioning, is that in 2018 I created the so-called Euro-Balkan Youth Forum, and it's a platform. So it's a platform of organizations and people and activists. So the purpose was to bring young people and artists from EU countries with Western Balkan countries together. That was a challenging task in the fact that, especially in the case of Kosovo, you had the visa issue. So you had many people who could not really travel to Greece. And then from the Greek side, you had the fact that there was no connection and there was a lot of fear. I mean, people would not really go to Kosovo. So the fact that we created, for example, the very first Greece-Kosovo Youth Forum in Thessaloniki in 2019, which was not supported by any political or religious organization, it was completely, let's say, independent. I think that was a very big achievement. I think that the fact that today there is a visa liberation is a big achievement. The fact that Kosovars visit now Thessaloniki by dozens every day now, and not every Saturday as it used to be, this is also a very big achievement. And the fact that ever since last month we have, let's say, touristic excursions going to Kosovo, to Pristina, I think this is also a very big thing. And these are all done, not with the mediation of governments necessarily, but with many people who belong to the wider realm of civil society and academia. So this is just an example of very good regional cooperation without, using the buzzword reconciliation, which I happen to dislike, but talking about synergy, talking about building trust, and talking about showing a different narrative, which is like the real and the modern narrative.
Thank you, Mary, for that. I think we are we are done with time, so maybe we can close on that. But I would like to ask all the panelists if they have any closing remarks to share, and then maybe we can end here. Okay, maybe not. Yeah, Fotini, yes.
No, I was going to give the floor to Yorgos or Marcus for any last comment or or something. But again, I would like to thank everybody else before I give you the floor. What I took note, we both took note with Elizabeth what the feedback was, and actually we might use this kind of information based on our discussion for a follow-up, or of course, as we're not done in the paper, we cannot overgeneralize the findings based on such a small research project. But at the same time, we did try to make sure to get information from various countries, and in various regions of the world, and countries that have different levels of diplomatic footprint globally. And also just to go into the methodology bit, in our interviews, we tried to interview people, especially young people, from a lot of different nationalities with different levels of educational background and professional experience, so as to make sure that we're kind of trying to address the opportunity gap that we also identified as a problem driving the shortage. But Yorgos or Marcos, the floor is to you to share some last comments. Thank you.
Yeah, but very, very brief. So, I mean, for Team Elizabeth, thanks a million for sharing a great paper with us. I mean, if you would add even more data, if you would add more global south and everything, perhaps in your sample, then the generalizability is even bigger. But you're definitely after something there, and thanks a lot to all the others who made comments. I also read the chat very attentively. And there was a very nice comment, I think a very true one, so that the authors should dig deeper because they're after something, and you guys, you really are. So congratulations, and thanks a lot to everyone for a great debate.
We're here to continue. That's my comment. And thank you very much for, again, trusting us with your paper, for your comments, Marcus and Mary and everybody in the chat. And this youthful and thoughtful spirit, I think we want to cultivate at Fox. And thanks to Manan also for organizing and chairing this. Yeah, Manan, your final word, I think.
Yeah, I think it's concluded. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.